Hello, my name is Jake Blount. I am a traditional folk musician from Providence, Rhode Island, and I would like to sincerely thank the Northeast Regional Folk Alliance Conference and Ethan Scott Baird for having me here as one of the keynote speakers. It's quite an honor. I had the opportunity to come to your conference in person once before everything stopped being in person, and while I wish I could be back there again, this will have to do for the time being. So thank you very much for bearing with me and bearing with us and being here in the ways that we're able to during this time. I had a difficult time thinking up what I was going to talk about today because most of the ordinary things that would come to mind, like playing music in a community and performing for people and traveling the world and having new experiences, have not happened in a very long time, and I don't really remember what they're like. And so I felt the need to delve a little bit more into what my experience has been of the past year and a half. I think that it's the role of keynote speakers at conferences like these to really tap into the most urgent issues facing the assembled body, whichever body it may be. And I think in our case, we've talked an awful lot about what this pandemic means for the longevity of our industry, for changes in the way that we run our events, and in some ways has prompted productive thinking as far as making things more accessible for people who already couldn't get to live events for financial reasons or reasons of disability access, or even were immune compromised already and had restrictions on where they could go and when. We have a lot to learn. We've talked a lot about it, and what I really wanted to discuss was where I've been as a performer and as a scholar over the past year and a half of not being able to engage with my art in the way that I normally do. So much of what I do as an old-time musician is oriented around playing music with other people that I really lost my motivation to continue my craft in the early days of this pandemic. I didn't know what the point would be in making folk music when there were no folk around to play it with, and I know I'm not alone in that. So I'm going to talk about that today. I want to talk about what the purpose of folk music, of folklore, has been throughout history. I want to talk about the things that we have to deal with today, what role our art can play in the issues of the present day, and also what role we have to play in the future. Because I think it's important, even in times as dark and unpredictable as these, to look forward at the things that are still coming down the road. First, I just wanted to talk generally about folklore. Of course, folk music is one facet of folk culture, and there are folk dances and folk tales and plastic arts, all these different things that come along with what we do. Even though the commercial industry that exists around our music has separated it to such a great degree from the context it originally developed in, those things are still important. And I think it's important to consider the role of folklore as a whole when we talk about folk music. And thinking about this, I found myself thinking back to the things so many of those art forms share in common, whether they be sculptural arts or paintings or folk tales that fill the night with imaginary monsters, whether they be religious texts or folk tales that talk about the creation of the universe, whether they be tales of lost ancestors that answer these unanswerable historical questions about our own lineages and histories as people. Where folklore thrives is in empty spaces and in ambiguity. There are so many examples of folklore taking the place of knowledge where true knowledge doesn't exist. And because of that, it's quite easy to understand why in our current world, which has grown so small and where cultures are mingling and growing faster than ever before thanks to the digital revolution and the arrival of relatively affordable airfare, folklore is beginning to lose its significance across the world. And we are fortunate as people in the industry of folk music to be amongst the more appreciated of the folk arts. I think it's safe to say that, especially after the past year, we can feel safe in the supportive attitudes of our fan bases. I know I was not the only one surprised to wind up doing half of my performances for tips on the internet for a good 6 months there and make more money than I had playing for guarantees in the prior half a year. I have been awestruck by the support that the community has provided to itself and that the fans have provided to the community. And I think it's important to dwell a little bit on what makes folk music stand out from the pack. Why do people value what we do so much? This is something I've thought quite a bit about because I grew up outside of the folk music world. Unlike many of my friends and colleagues who have been in this universe because their parents were a part of it, their parents or aunts and uncles took up the ukulele in the 60s or whatever it was, and so it was written. I grew up black in Washington, D.C., having very little connection to the folklore that I now participate in, the folk music culture that I now participate in, despite the fact that my immediate family came from a farm in Southern Virginia. I was separated. I did not feel close to my rural roots and the rural roots of my people. And it was only as an adult, moving away from home and trying to find a way to grapple with the nascent Black Lives Matter movement and the conflict that that brought and the ways that it changed the way that I saw the people I'd grown up around and the places that I'd grown up, I felt that I needed to go back and find out how my ancestors would have dealt with the situation. And what I found was that I would uncover these old songs, these old stories from back in the day, and that they were meaningful to me despite the fact that I didn't know who'd written them, that I'd never lived in those same circumstances, that they told a story that was impactful to me and spoke to my own experiences, despite the fact that the experiences of the authors, whoever they were so very different. And I found a very meaningful quote to me from W.E.B. Du Bois in The Soul of Black Folk, where he talked about this same revelation when he encountered that same body of music. They that walked in darkness sang songs in the olden days, sorrow songs, for they were weary at heart. Ever since I was a child, these songs have stirred me strangely. They came out of the south unknown to me, one by one, and yet at once I knew them as of me and of mine. Out of them rose for me morning, noon, and night, bursts of wonderful melody, full of the voices of my brothers and sisters, full of the voices of the past. Scholar Samuel A. Floyd explored that same concept in a more theoretical context and in greater depth. He interviewed a musician named Sidney Bechet, who in turn referenced a formerly enslaved musician named Omar, and said, in speaking about what made black music, what made black folk music, broadly defined, effective, he said, "It was the long song, and the good musicianers, they all heard it behind them. They all had an Omar, somebody like an Omar, somebody that was their Omar. It didn't need just recollecting somebody like that. It was the feeling of someone back there, hearing the song like it was coming up from somewhere." Floyd himself elaborated, "For Bechet, black music making was the translation of the memory into sound, and the sound into memory. The memory goes back beyond Omar and the slave experience in America to Africa, and the musical retentions and performance practices of African American music helped and still help to preserve this memory, recalling the mysteries of myth and the trappings of ritual long after they are no longer functional." And here Floyd struck at the heart of what I most want to say about our music, that it is a way of encoding these memories, of transferring principles, of transferring knowledge, of transferring the accumulated experience of a culture group from one generation to the next, to such a great degree that it interlocks with all the other types of folklore that I mentioned before, and references them and keeps them alive, even when they've been, in the case of black music, banned in the country. We're talking about forms of historical art that were legally prohibited, right? How did these rhythms persist when there were no drums allowed? How did the lyrics persist when the languages were banned? There's a great story here. And it's a story that can be heard in all different folk genres across the world. It speaks volumes that so much of the folk movement and so many of the world's most valuable folk traditions come from the most marginalized communities. Because who has not been empowered throughout history to leave a record in the more normal, established archival practices? Who was not literate? Who was not permitted legally or socially to speak their full truth and be heard without fear of repercussions? This is the role of folk music, to leave a historical record and to fill in the empty spaces in that historical record for people who need to look back and need to perceive themselves, need to perceive where their struggles came from. So what is the purpose of the folk music that we are making today? It can be hard to look back on something like the transatlantic slave trade or the colonization of what we now call the United States and the songs that came out of that historical era and those historical events and think that we can create anything that could measure up. W.E.B. Du Bois referred to these old folk songs as the siftings of centuries, which I love, that these are things that have been tested by time and that the wheat has been separated from the chaff, and what we now have are the golden nuggets, and certainly that is true, and certainly not all of the music that we make today will persist hundreds of years later and be sung by our descendants. However, we have many valuable things to contribute. I would be hard-pressed to talk about the historic experiences of my generation, of all the living generations, without talking about what we're presently going through as a country and as a world. The COVID-19 pandemic is like nothing we've seen in 100 years. And I think I speak for many millennials and Gen Zers when I say that I am eager to someday live in precedented times. As someone born 6 years before 9/11, I don't feel that I've had much time to rest in my life. And I think it's important that people who are in our situation find a way to convey that, to write that down, because even as I can write a story about what it meant to lose my work for 3 months in the space of a day when people realized what this virus was going to be, even though I can tell people verbally how odd it was to look out of my window and wonder where the wreckage was because my world had collapsed and my neighborhood looked completely normal outside, I don't think that the impact comes through. I don't think that, for me, reading narratives from those enslaved Black people back in the day had the same impact as hearing them sing about what they'd been through, even when they could speak the full truth. I would be remiss not to mention that at the same time as the COVID-19 pandemic was going on, our democracy was imperiled. I was in Washington, D.C. on January 6th with my parents, and I will never forget the moment my mother came running up the stairs yelling that they had breached the Capitol dome. I will never forget going downstairs to find my father watching the TV, frantically worrying whether or not Congress was going to be executed on the floor of the United States Capitol. More than that, though, we have before us a set of challenges that will make both the COVID-19 pandemic and the imminent threat to the democracy of the United States seem fairly small in the form of climate change. We have set in motion a series of processes that are now likely beyond our control, and whether or not we rise to the challenge of the next coming decades, the civilization that emerges will be unrecognizable. And here's where I want to talk about our responsibility as folk artists to the future. As devastating as the COVID-19 pandemic is, and as devastating as the near collapse of our democracy was, these things were both foreshocks for the cataclysmic change our environmental troubles will bring about over the next centuries. Our current technology is incompatible with the survival of our species. Our current politics are incompatible with the survival of our species, and capitalism is fundamentally incompatible with the survival of our species. Whether or not we rise to these challenges, develop the technologies necessary, make the changes politically and economically that we need to make, something will come out of the ashes that looks very different than what we have now. Let's look at the worst case scenario. Say that we completely fail to address these issues, that weather patterns go out of control, that the Midwest becomes a desert, that there are refugee crises and wars and food shortages. The present methods that we use to encode knowledge in books and in the internet may not be accessible anymore. There may not be an internet. There may not be electricity. There may not be literacy enough to read those books and understand their contents. What we will have in that situation is oral history, is the musical traditions that we create. What we build together here is the most valuable and reliable historical record that's currently being created. But I'm not here just to be a doomsday prophet, and I don't think that's necessarily the most likely outcome. Let's look at the best case scenarios. Say that our descendants are indeed competent enough to compensate for our devastating mismanagement of our society and the planet, and are able to reformulate their economies so that they are not relying on infinitely expanding resources that do not exist, so that they are not engaging in devastating mining practices that damage the environment, so that they're able to create carbon fixing technologies that can stall and even maybe reverse some of the devastating climatic changes we've caused as a species. They're going to have to do a lot of learning from our mistakes, and I don't think anybody is in a better position to talk about humanity's mistakes than the past 2 or 3 generations of our species. And I speak now mainly to my own generational compatriots, my fellow millennials, Gen Zers. As a group, we are set to witness the period of greatest precarity that humanity has witnessed in 75,000 years. That is a tremendous responsibility. And even though we as individuals can hardly hope to rise to that occasion and produce artwork that speaks so deeply to an existential threat that's so large that sometimes it doesn't even feel real or part of our everyday lives, we do have a responsibility as a community to do what we can to leave something behind. And that means that we need to be ready to pass the baton, even as we wait hopefully for it to be passed to us. Now, what does that mean? How are we able to create something enduring, something lasting, something that will leave a mark and that maybe people will find use in a couple centuries down the line when they most need to hear what things looked like while we were sitting here watching it teeter on the brink? To me, that means incorporating musicians of different backgrounds and perspectives and embracing all the sonic variety that comes along with that. It isn't enough to open the door and say, you're welcome to come in as long as you do it our way. We have to be willing to meet people where they're at, to understand that they bring new things to the table, new sounds as well as new ideas. And I mean that across the board. I mean in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity, nationality. There is no reason why something as broadly titled as folk music should be confined to one particular folk. It's been done before, and not for the right reasons, and it's important for all of us to remember to keep an open mind. How are we to build a lasting tradition, something that can survive, if we are not willing to open the door to new perspectives, to new sounds, and to new practices? More than that, I want to issue a challenge to the industry as a whole. Whether you are a festival booker, whether you are a record label, whether you're an academic, whether you're working for a nonprofit and you're in a position to give grants to people, whether you are an artist, it is important right now that we create the most compelling, accessible art that we can. Folk music has historically been one of the greatest drivers of political change, especially in the United States, but I would argue the world over. What we have to say as a community is important. We can have a major impact if we decide that we are ready to have it, and that means we need to be able to speak to people. This is the time, this is the moment when we have to produce the best things that we can to leverage all of the influence at our disposal to make sure that humanity, that our government, everything down to this communal level gets back on the right track. We are running out of time to fix things. I began this address by noting what I consider to be a primary function of folklore, filling in empty spaces and ambiguity. Our work thrives in ambiguity and in uncertainty, in situations where people have space to wonder. The past year and a half have forced a harsh, uncompromising, and consuming truth upon us all. The future of our civilization and of our species has perhaps never been less certain than it is right now. The cycles of the world have turned, and the earth is reclaiming its mysteries. As weather patterns grow strange, new diseases emerge, humanitarian crises escalate, and nations begin to sink beneath the waves, gaps are beginning to reappear in our understanding of the world, our understanding of our place within the world, and in our understandings of each other. The time has come for a new folklore that can bridge these gaps and help us navigate the changes to come. Are we prepared to rise to that challenge?